They buried his driveway in cement, laughing at his loss. But the next day, bulldozers rolled in, and the HOA's entire road was shut down. He opened the front door, and only then understood how quiet the street had become. The morning smelled of diesel and wet earth, a heavy, chemical hush that clung to the air like a dare. At first the scene made no sense. Cement trucks idling at the curb, a smear of gray that glinted in the weak sunlight. And then his eyes found the driveway. What had been a ribbon of blacktop and gravel, the small, familiar lane that carried him out of his life every day, had been flattened and finished in a single, brutal sweep. Fresh concrete lay there, smooth as a sheet of glass and still faintly steaming. His car sat behind the closed garage door, trapped like an animal in a cage the size of a man's stubbornness. He stood on the threshold, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and felt the world narrow to a handful of images: the concrete, the truck tires leaving deep tracks in soft shoulders, the men who had backed away without meeting his eyes. They clustered near the contractor's van, hands shoved deep into the pockets of dirty jackets, shoulders hunched under a shared discomfort. None of them wanted to be the first to speak. None of them seemed ready to be the first to say the word that would make it all real. The HOA did this. At the end of the block, arms folded like a juror who has already decided a sentence, stood Richard Hale. He was trim in a polo shirt, a little too obviously clean for the dust at his shoes. His hair was combed, his jaw sharp like a man selected for the role of ruler. Richard's smile was small, but absolute. Something practiced, the kind of smile that had been used to end disputes, to sign off on rules, to collect fines. He had the look of someone convinced of his own authority. He believed the morning belonged to him. A dozen yards away, the protagonist, David Mercer, kept his face a practice calm. People who knew him described him as the sort of man who didn't need to shout to be heard, the kind who made decisions by the weight of their patience. He watched the cement like a patient predator watches its prey. There was anger under the surface, a low, controlled heat, but the anger was precise. It did not spill, it accounted. He folded his arms the way a man folds plans he has not yet revealed. "Morning, David," Richard called, his voice carrying across the asphalt, as if this were some silly neighborly spat rather than what it truly was: calculated sabotage. He tipped his head, as if waiting for acceptance of his latest decree. There were men behind him, board members who had taken sides years ago and who now watched like an audience at the end of a play, their faces taut with amusement or fear. Behind the curtained windows, other men, neighbors, peered out. Some had the look of men considering whether to take a step forward or crawl back into safe anonymity. All of them were men. This was Richard's town, his club, and he liked it that way. David's voice was quiet when he answered. "You did this," he said. No flair, no accusation, just factual declaration. The words landed like a stone in a still pool. Richard shrugged, the gesture made small by the distance. The community standard had to be upheld. "You know how this works." The smile didn't falter. His palms were too clean. "We followed procedure." The workers divided their silence into small, guilty pieces. One of them, a younger fellow with a cracked ceramic mug shoved into his jacket pocket, glanced toward David as if looking for permission to talk. He said nothing. He could not without losing the warmth of a paycheck, and perhaps worse, without drawing the attention of the man who made those paychecks possible. The contractor's name on the truck was generic, a flimsy camouflage: Meridian Driveways. It felt like a company designed to exist only when needed and dissolve when watched. David stepped off his porch and walked closer, every footfall measured. Dress shoes left tiny impressions on the packed gravel at the edge of the new concrete. Men watched him, the air between them thick as fog. He turned his phone to camera and began filming methodically. He did not raise his voice. He simply recorded. The men in the boots looked away. Richard's jaw hardened. "You're making a scene," Richard said. He did not come any closer. He knew, instinctively, to keep the distance that would make him safe, the distance of chairs across a meeting table or the polished wood of a podium. There were notices. David slowed his walk and angled the phone so the timestamp and the commercial's bland contractor logo were in frame. "Not to me," he said. He kept his hands loose at his sides. His temper, sharp as a razor, had been sheathed years ago by necessity. He had learned to let evidence do the screaming. It was then David saw the clipboard half hidden under a low hedgerow, where the youngest of the crew had dropped it in a hurry. The sound of his boot against the curved plastic cover made the worker flinch as if a secret had been touched. The clipboard was full of paperwork, forms with checkboxes, a single typed letterhead that, in the right light, revealed the HOA's crest. Someone had stamped it, and at the bottom, in a looping, confident hand, was Richard's signature. It looked official enough to be real. The worker swore softly, only one syllable, a man's involuntary curse, and then the grown man's mouth closed like a trap. He could not speak without the permission of his employer or the courage of a conscience that had been trained out of him. David's eyes flicked to the clipboard and then to the group. He could already see the path this offered. Proof, a paper trail, something he could hold up when the men who had been silent so long tried to speak for themselves. He pocketed his phone, though he kept the recording running. "You think that's yours?" Richard said from across the drive, the accusation sliding out like an accusation taught by years of complaint forms. His tone suggested that if it were his handwriting, then it was nothing at all, just another signature on another sheet. That was the arrogance of men who run institutions with ink and fear. They make paperwork the weapon and the shield. David gave the clipboard a look and then made a soft decision. He would not snatch it, not now. That would be the drama Richard wanted. Instead, he mimed a slow turn and walked back toward his yard, as if conceding something, as if planning to accept this indignity. He moved like a man willing to accept a defeat so that the defeat could be examined. On the porch, he dialed a number he never used unless the neighborhood had crossed into illegality. It was to a neighbor 2 houses down, Daniel Ortega, a retired city inspector who liked his tea hot and his conscience warm. Daniel's front camera had become a rumor in the cul-de-sac, an old model Ring doorbell with a stubborn blue light that blinked every time a car passed. 20 minutes earlier, Daniel had been out walking his dog. Now his window opened and Daniel's face appeared, tired and worried, and, for the first time, angry in a way that belonged in David's vocabulary. Daniel's camera, David knew, had probably recorded the trucks. Daniel's voice was threaded with the rasp of sleep. He blinked the last of it away and then leaned forward, his window creaking. He was a man used to paperwork, too. There was a ledger on his kitchen table that confirmed it. "What happened?" "They pour my driveway," David said simply. Daniel's face hardened as he looked past his own curtain. "I saw it. I was gone by the time they started, but my doorbell caught the trucks. I'll go pull footage." The promise was small, but it was a crack in the armor. Proof was the thing Richard had not bargained for. Richard had assumed compliance. He had not accounted for a man who kept records in his head and neighbors like Daniel who kept records on their doorframes. As Daniel moved inside to find the footage, a more dangerous sound reached David's ears. The low, rolling thump of a second vehicle, heavier, one that announced itself with authority. From the far end of the street, a taller, black SUV rolled up and parked. Out of it stepped a man David hadn't seen before, broad-shouldered and wearing a jacket that said security. He called up to Richard, and they exchanged brief words, their voices a low, private language of power. Men who share the same world of influence develop these codes. A glance, a nod, a sound that means we are aligned. David felt the hair rise at the back of his neck. There were layers here he had not expected. It was not only an HOA board and some contracted crew. It had the trappings of men prepared to enforce authority. A presence of force that implied consequences for those who cross lines. Lines that were being erased as the pavement set. He filmed what he could. He filmed the security man's truck plates, the men folding their hands like men with final offers, the clipboard half hidden in the hedge. He filmed the hose lines, the sweep of water that cooled the new concrete skin, the way the men dared not look him in the eye. Each filmed frame was a small, stubborn tree planted in a future forest of proof. "David," Richard called again, the voice softer now, like someone slipping into the role of conciliator. "We can discuss this. There's an appeal process. You missed the hearing." There had been no hearing. That lie clattered under the weight of the clipboard. Still, David did not shout. He did not yet reveal the particular blade he held. Instead, he tucked the phone back into his pocket and walked to the garage, touching the metal seam with the pads of his fingers. The cool metal under his palm felt like the hinge between what was and what could be. His reflection was a ghost in the polished door, a man who looked ordinary in the collapsing morning. Ordinary, until the ordinary refused to be what men like Richard assumed it was. He imagined what it would be like to be Richard at that moment. Confident, smug, sure that his small kingdom was secure. It explained why Richard had done what he did. Because men in small thrones never learn to fear what their subjects can become when they simply stop complying. But conjecture was water on hot stone. It glazed over quickly and left nothing. David needed facts. He needed witnesses who would step out from behind curtains and stop pretending they didn't see. He needed cameras and signatures and receipts and the microscopic errors an arrogant man always left in his wake. He crouched beside the hedgerow. The clipboard had slid deeper than it first appeared, tucked in under the leaves like a forgotten badge. David extracted it with the careful hands of a man who had once disassembled radios and put them back together until they worked better than before. The forms were stamped with a seal he recognized, the HOA seal. There was, at the bottom of the page, a signature that could be matched to the board's own posted minutes. Richard had always taken pains to sign everything. He loved the mark of his name like a lord loves his coat of arms. The signature was the same looped flourish he used in emails, the same pressure of ink his son had learned to imitate on school projects. David placed the clipboard against his chest and stood. When he looked up, Richard's expression had shifted. For a beat, there was an emotion that did not fit on the man. No practiced smile, no carefully cultivated authority, but something like a flash of calculation. It was not fear, it was curiosity. Men like Richard find it impossible to be surprised for long. They pivot, and when they pivot, they appear to know every step that follows. "You took that," Richard said abruptly, and the accusation had an edge to it now, like someone who had been told by a challenger that the rules had changed. David did not answer. He felt the weight of the clipboard as if it were already a legal document, the tangible proof that would turn whispers into accusations. He felt the buzzing certainty that the morning had, without him yet acting, created a fault line between what Richard controlled and what would control Richard. He thought of the neighbors, men who peeked from their curtains and shifted under the gaze of the man who chose to humiliate one of them that morning. He thought of Daniel going inside to pull footage. He thought of the security man, who was probably there to ensure no one left with more than they had permission to take. From somewhere inside the house came the soft scrape of a drawer being opened. David had a small portable hard drive he used for work, the kind that dulled arguments with charts and timelines. He had always kept it in a kitchen drawer under a stack of light bills. He reached for it on his way back inside, palms steady, feeling the cool plastic as if it were the last piece of armor he would defend himself with. He wanted the footage, the timestamps, the receipts, anything that would make the morning not just a humiliation, but a legal wrong. Before he could move further, a voice rose from down the block, a man's voice carrying the brittle courage of someone who had decided not to be small. "Hey, that's Sam Walker's driveway," the voice called out. Sam was a neighbor 2 doors down, a man with bad knees and a loyalty to fairness that occasionally overruled fear. Men watched as he walked into the street, cane tapping a determined rhythm, face flushed from the climb. He looked at the concrete, at the closed garage door, then at Richard. "What gives you the right?" Richard's eyes narrowed in a way that suggested he was calculating the cost of using men like Sam as examples. "Community standards," he said. He had this answer ready for any question. It was the talisman by which he warded off the sickly light of accountability. Sam's mouth tightened. "You don't get to pour over my neighbor's life like it's a sandbox you own." His voice trembled on the last words, not with fear, but with an old, righteous anger that men of his age recycled until it became a local law. Around him, other curtains fluttered as windows cracked open. The laboring quiet of the morning thickened into a collective attention. For the first time, the board members' faces flickered. They had known this could happen. Someone, somewhere, would step off the thin path of compliance. It was the risk of rulemaking. David felt a current of something like relief at Sam's intervention. It wasn't relief because he needed the help. It was relief because the pattern had started to crack on its own. Pressure multiplies, not only because one man acts, but because others decide that the pressure is more than they can live under. The scene was not over. It would not be simple, but it had moved from private humiliation to public question. He turned to Richard, and where Richard had once only seen an obstacle, he now saw a man who would not be rushed or baited. He saw someone who would let evidence pile like stones until the house of cards collapsed. He imagined, briefly, the evening when men would say afterward that this was when the balance shifted, when a line had been crossed so hard it could be measured. David slid the clipboard under his arm and walked back into his house, closing the door with an ordinary sound that nevertheless felt like a drumbeat in his chest. Inside, he did the things men like him did. He backed up footage, he typed notes with the methodical attention of someone who knows that memory is a poor substitute for proof, and he called the people who would not be surprised when the situation required them. He did not shout. He did not break. He planned. Outside, the street hummed with 1,000 tiny judgments. The cement cooled in the morning light like a seal. Some neighbors walked out to look, hands on hips. A tall man across the street shook his head slowly and then turned to his lawnmower, as if the world could be put back to the way it once had been with a blade. But David, since the line had been drawn, the first score had been written on a ledger that could not be erased with a signature. Richard stood a while longer, then climbed into his car, his whole posture saying he had done the right thing. As the car pulled away, David stepped back onto his porch and filmed the motion. He did not raise his voice. He pressed his thumb to the screen and saved the clip in a folder labeled simply, Evidence. He knew, with the slow certainty of a man who has read the ends of books before, that this morning would not be contained. Something had been set into motion. The cement was dry in places, still slightly tacky in others, and it gleamed in the sun like a promise. He did not know, yet, what exact shape the coming conflict would take, only that it would be surgical and that it would expose seams Richard believed hidden. He smiled a small smile, not of triumph but of resolved patience. He whispered into the quiet of his kitchen, more to himself than to any listener. "You think you've sealed me in, Richard. You don't know what doors I can open." Outside, behind the hedges and curtained windows, men listened or pretended to listen, and the neighborhood's morning turned on as the first paperwork began to be gathered and the first phone calls were made. The concrete cooled. The game had changed. Richard Langston liked to think of himself as the heartbeat of Maplewood Estates. Every Saturday morning, as the sun washed the rows of identical brick houses in gold, he would appear on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, like a general surveying his troops. His gray hair was slicked neatly back, his shirt always tucked into pressed khakis, and his polished loafers clicked against the pavement with the sharpness of authority. Where others saw a quiet suburban street, Richard saw territory. Rules were his weapons, fines his bullets, and fear his crown. Neighbors lowered their heads when he walked past. Some muttered a nervous good morning, while others pretended to busy themselves with their lawns, hoping to avoid eye contact. Everyone knew that a careless smile, a trash can out too long, or even a misplaced lawn ornament could trigger a violation notice on their door by evening. Richard relished those moments, the shuffling apologies, the checks written reluctantly, the whispered complaints quickly silenced when he appeared. But one house refused to bend. The man who lived there never raised his voice, never argued, never begged for forgiveness. Where other men in the neighborhood sent desperate emails to the HOA board, trying to appeal their fines, this one let the letters pile up unanswered. Where others pulled down decorations the moment Richard barked, this one calmly left his up until the proper date. He never stormed into meetings, never pleaded for mercy. He simply stood, silent, watching Richard with a steady gaze that unsettled him more than he liked to admit. Richard told himself the silence meant weakness. Men who were strong fought back. Men who were smart argued. But silence? Silence meant submission. Still, deep inside, a quiet unease grew. One evening, Richard convened his board of loyal men in the clubhouse. The air smelled of coffee and printer ink. the table stacked with folders of violations. They sat in leather chairs like a council of judges, though everyone knew only one man made the decisions. "This neighbor," Richard began, tapping his pen against the folder with the protagonist's name on it, "has ignored every fine I've sent, every letter, every warning." The board members shifted uncomfortably. A tall man with thinning hair cleared his throat. "Maybe he just doesn't care, Richard." Richard's lips curled into a thin smile. "Everyone cares when the consequences become too heavy. Everyone." He leaned forward, eyes glittering with something darker than simple frustration. "You see, gentlemen, rules are not about grass height or trash cans. They're about control. If one man is allowed to defy us, what's to stop the rest?" A heavy silence followed. The men nodded reluctantly, some out of fear, others out of greed for the power and perks Richard distributed. That night, Richard patrolled the street with renewed purpose. He stopped in front of the silent neighbor's house, staring at the neat yard, the clean walkway, the quiet windows. Nothing out of place. Nothing to punish. His jaw tightened. That was the insult. This man left no cracks to exploit. He played by the rules but ignored Richard's authority, and that was worse than breaking them outright. Richard thought back to the complaint he had filed weeks earlier. Excessive noise. The man hadn't even been home that night, yet Richard had sent the notice anyway. Still no reaction. Not even a word. That stillness, that calm refusal to acknowledge him, felt like a slap. The following morning, Richard escalated. He spread whispers at the coffee shop where the neighborhood men gathered. "You know," he said casually, "I heard our quiet friend down the street might be having financial trouble. Explains why he doesn't pay his fines. Could be hiding something." Heads turned. Murmurs spread. Richard smirked as he sipped his coffee, knowing rumors were more powerful than paper fines. But when he passed the man later that day, the neighbor met his eyes with that same calm, unshaken stare. No anger, no fear, just patience. Richard felt his chest tighten. For the first time, he wondered if maybe silence wasn't weakness at all. By late autumn, frustration burned like acid in his veins. He needed a show of power, something so bold, so humiliating, that no one in the neighborhood would dare resist him again. His men hesitated, whispering doubts, but Richard silenced them with promises of favors and veiled threats. Then one night, under the cover of darkness, Richard made his move. He stood at the edge of the neighbor's driveway, clipboard in one hand, flashlight in the other. Behind him, two board members watched nervously, their breaths fogging in the cold air. "Are you sure about this?" one whispered. Richard's smile was sharp, almost gleeful. "This is the final blow. When he wakes up tomorrow, he'll understand. And so will everyone else." The cement truck rumbled quietly down the street, its headlights dimmed. The driver, paid in cash, said nothing as he opened the chute. Thick, gray cement poured into the driveway, spreading like a heavy blanket, sealing the man's car in place. The sound was low, almost sinister, as if the very street held its breath. Richard watched with satisfaction, his heart racing. He imagined the look on a man's face in the morning, the helpless frustration, the humiliation in front of the entire neighborhood. He pictured neighbors whispering, pointing, realizing that no one could stand against him. When the last of the cement settled, Richard stepped forward and scrawled something on his clipboard. A false violation, one more paper dagger to drive home the point. He handed copies to his men. "Spread these," he ordered. "Let everyone see what happens when someone defies me." As the truck pulled away, Richard lingered, staring at the silent house. The windows remained dark, curtains drawn, no sign of life. For a flicker of a moment, unease tugged at him again. What if the man wasn't helpless? What if silence meant something else? He shook the thought away. Power belonged to those who seized it, and tonight, Richard had seized it completely. But deep in the shadows of that quiet house, behind those still windows, someone was awake, watching, waiting, and Richard had just made his biggest mistake. The morning after the cement was poured, the street awoke in whispers. Curtains parted, blinds shifted, and neighbors stood at their windows, drawn by the sight of the hardened, gray mass that now sealed the protagonist's driveway. A few men gathered at the edge of their lawns, speaking in hushed tones. The pale winter sun glared off the surface of the cement, mocking the quiet normalcy of Maplewood Estates. Richard Langston walked past, clipboard tucked under his arm, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He didn't need to speak. His smirk said enough. To him, it was the perfect demonstration. No one could cross him without consequence. But beneath his pride lurked a dangerous blindness. Because this time he had gone too far. The man whose driveway had been destroyed stepped out onto his porch, not with the fury Richard expected, but with an unsettling calm. His face was expressionless, his movements steady. He paused at the top of the steps, surveying the mess as though studying a puzzle rather than a personal violation. Without a word, he pulled a phone from his pocket and began to take pictures. Every angle, every detail, the jagged edges where the cement spilled onto the grass. The faint tire tracks left by the truck that had come in the night. The uneven hardening that revealed how hastily the job had been done. His eyes missed nothing. A neighbor, a stocky man in flannel, hesitated by the curb. That's not legal, is it? He muttered, mostly to himself. The protagonist turned his phone to record, walking slowly around the driveway. He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. The silence was its own statement, as heavy as the cement itself. By mid-morning, the story spread. Whispers grew into rumors, and rumors hardened into certainty. If Richard could do this to one homeowner, he could do it to anyone. Some residents were horrified, realizing they had been living under more than rules. They had been living under a man's will. Others cowered deeper into their routines, terrified of drawing Richard's wrath. The neighborhood was splitting, and the crack began at the edge of that driveway. Richard, however, thrived on the chaos. That afternoon, he called a meeting in the clubhouse. Rows of folding chairs filled with uneasy men. At the front, Richard stood tall, one hand gripping his clipboard like a scepter. This, he declared, pointing toward a printed photo of the cemented driveway, is what happens when a resident ignores repeated violations. We cannot allow one man to disregard the rules we all agreed to live by. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One man raised a hand timidly. But the driveway belongs to him, doesn't it? I mean, can the HOA even? Richard's glare silenced him instantly. Community standards apply to everyone. If we let one person defy them, order collapses. His voice sharpened, dripping with contempt. He is the problem, not me. Him. Laughter followed, shallow and uncertain, as Richard mocked the silent homeowner, mimicking his calm expression with exaggerated stillness. See? He doesn't fight back because he knows he's guilty. The protagonist wasn't present, but his absence was felt. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that while Richard shouted and mocked, the neighbor never raised his voice. And yet, his silence carried more weight than Richard's anger. Back at his house, the protagonist was busy. He uploaded the pictures and videos onto a secure drive, labeling each one with the time and date. He walked the neighborhood with a quiet confidence, approaching men who had seen the truck arrive in the night. One by one, he spoke with them. Some refused to get involved, eyes darting nervously toward Richard's house. But a few, tired of living in fear, agreed to talk. "I saw him," whispered one man, glancing over his shoulder. Clipboard and all. He was standing right there when they poured it. Another nodded. They paid the driver in cash. "I didn't hear numbers, but I saw the bills." He knew it wasn't legal. The protagonist recorded their words, each testimony another brick in the wall he was building. He also went further, digging into the city ordinances. In the quiet of his study, under the soft glow of a desk lamp, he flipped through pages of regulations. His finger stopped at a section highlighted in yellow. Tampering with or obstructing access to private residential property without owner consent constitutes unlawful destruction of property. He sat back, eyes narrowing. Richard hadn't just crossed a line, he had broken a law. The next day, a letter arrived. The envelope bore the HOA's seal, but the words inside carried Richard's venom. "Your driveway required correction for community aesthetic standards," it read. "The cement was poured to bring your property in line with expectations." Refusal to comply will result in further action, including legal escalation. The protagonist folded the letter neatly, slipped it into a file, and added it to his growing collection. He didn't react, didn't storm into Richard's office. He simply continued gathering. Richard, misinterpreting the silence yet again, doubled down. He sent more letters. He mocked the man openly at gatherings, painting him as stubborn, reckless, even dangerous to the harmony of Maplewood Estates. Neighbors who once feared Richard now looked to the silent man, watching closely, wondering what he was planning. Behind the calm expression, the protagonist was already setting the trap. At the coffee shop one afternoon, he quietly slid into a booth across from one of the cement workers who had been on the job. The man's hands trembled around his cup. "You were there that night," the protagonist said softly, voice even, unthreatening. "You saw who gave the orders." The worker swallowed hard. I just do what I'm told. Cash is cash." "Understand," the man replied. He pulled out his phone and pressed record, setting it gently on the table. "All I need is the truth." For a long moment, the worker hesitated. Then he leaned forward and whispered, "It was him, the HOA president. He told us exactly where to pour. Said it was approved. But it wasn't. We all knew it wasn't." The recording saved with a soft click. Another weapon secured. Meanwhile, Richard's empire began to show cracks. The protagonist noticed irregularities in the HOA's financial records. Large sums withdrawn for maintenance projects that didn't exist, reimbursements approved without receipts, cash transfers unaccounted for. He copied documents quietly, each page adding to the weight of evidence. Late one evening, Richard sat in his office, staring at the books. His hand tapped nervously against the desk. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Whispers had reached him that some neighbors were questioning his methods. Some even wondered aloud whether he had the right to touch another man's driveway. He dismissed the thought with a shake of his head. "They're scared. They'll fall in line. They always do." But even as he said it, his hand trembled. Across the street, the protagonist closed a folder thick with evidence. Photos, recordings, testimonies, financial documents, each piece carefully organized. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest shadow of a smile crossing his face. Richard had declared war. But this time, the man he was targeting was armed. And Richard's fatal mistake wasn't just pouring the cement. It was underestimating who he was dealing with. The days after the cement incident unfolded like the tightening of a vice. Richard strutted about the neighborhood as though he had won his final battle. His smug laughter carried across manicured lawns, and his clipboard snapped shut with a satisfying click each time he passed a neighbor's home. To the casual observer, it seemed as though the quiet homeowner had been silenced for good, trapped behind his wall of cement and shame. But silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. Behind closed doors, the man who Richard had underestimated was laying out a plan so meticulous, so calculated, that would strike the HOA like a thunderclap. His office desk became a war table, folders stacked neatly, evidence organized into binders, recordings labeled, timestamps written in careful ink. But evidence was only half the weapon. The other half was something Richard could never have predicted. The calm neighbor was not simply an ordinary homeowner. He was the owner of a construction company, a modest but powerful operation that specialized in excavation, road work, and site preparation. His livelihood revolved around the very machines that could reshape landscapes in hours: bulldozers, backhoes, dump trucks, and loaders. For years, he had kept his profession quiet, blending into the neighborhood like any other resident. Now, that quiet background was about to become Richard's nightmare. The first hints appeared subtly. A flatbed truck rolled into the neighborhood late one afternoon, carrying a compact excavator. It parked innocently on a side street under the excuse of ongoing municipal work. Neighbors peered from their porches, whispering. Richard noticed too, but dismissed it as coincidence. A day later, a dump truck rumbled in, idling near the cul-de-sac. Then came a bulldozer, its wide steel blade gleaming under the streetlights. Each arrival was staged, casual, as if part of some unremarkable job. Yet to those paying attention, The pieces of a larger picture were falling into place. Inside his home, the protagonist met with his small crew, men he trusted with both loyalty and silence. Around his dining table, they leaned over maps of the neighborhood. "You're sure about this?" one of them asked, his rough hands folded tightly. The protagonist nodded, his calm eyes scanning the room. Richard crossed a line. He thinks the rules protect him. They don't. Tomorrow, we show him what it feels like when the rules no longer work in his favor. A murmur of agreement circled the table. These were men used to building, to creating order out of dirt and steel. But tonight, they would be tearing something down, not with destruction, but with strategy. Meanwhile, Richard continued his crusade. Another letter arrived at the homeowner's mailbox, dripping with arrogance. Failure to acknowledge your corrected driveway remains a violation. Additional penalties will be applied to your account. You are advised to consider compliance before the board escalates matters further. The protagonist read the letter without flinching. He slid it into his growing folder, the file now so thick it could topple a king. But paperwork would come later. First, Richard needed a reminder, one he could not ignore, one the entire neighborhood would witness. That night, under the cloak of darkness, the crew moved. Engines hummed quietly as machines rolled into position. Tires pressed softly against asphalt, hydraulics sighed, and steel blades scraped gently over the road. The men worked like shadows, each knowing exactly where to stand and when to stop. By dawn, Maplewood Estates had become a fortress turned prison. Bulldozers blocked the main entrance, their blades angled like shields. Dump trucks were parked side by side at the secondary exit, sealing it tight. At the back gate, an excavator crouched like a sentinel, its arm raised in warning. Every path in and out of the gated community was cut off. When the sun rose, the neighborhood awoke to chaos. Men in suits opened their front doors, briefcases in hand, only to stop short at the sight of steel giants blocking their commute. Car engines revved and then fell silent as drivers realized the road was impassable. Confused shouts filled the air. "What's going on?" a neighbor demanded, staring at the massive bulldozer parked across the asphalt. This can't be real," another muttered, his jaw slack. Children pointed excitedly from their porches while their fathers exchanged nervous glances. Some laughed nervously, others panicked, already late for work. Phones were pulled out, calls to bosses made, explanations stumbled through. And then they saw him, standing in front of the largest bulldozer, arms folded across his chest, was the man Richard had tried to break. He wasn't shouting, wasn't boasting. He simply stood there, calm and resolute, the morning sun casting a long shadow at his feet. His silence was heavier than any roar of engines. Richard stormed out of his house, his face flushed crimson. His clipboard was clutched tightly under one arm like a lifeline. He marched across the street, his polished shoes clicking furiously on the pavement. "What is this?" he shouted, gesturing wildly at the machines. "You can't do this. This is illegal. Move these right now." The protagonist finally broke his silence. His voice was even, almost conversational, yet it carried through the air like a hammer blow. "Driveways," he said, locking eyes with Richard, "go both ways." The crowd fell silent. Neighbors who had lived under Richard's thumb for years felt something stir. Relief, amusement, even awe. Some chuckled under their breath. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, as though witnessing the impossible. Richard's arrogance cracked. His lips trembled as he tried to regain his footing. You think this is funny? Blocking the community? You're only making yourself look guilty." The protagonist tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze unshaken. "Funny how being trapped feels, isn't it? Consider this a taste of what you've been doing to everyone here." Richard spun toward the gathering crowd. "Don't just stand there. This man is breaking the law. Call the police. Call." But no one moved. Some neighbors crossed their arms, mimicking the stance of the protagonist. Others exchanged knowing smiles. One even muttered, "Looks like someone finally gave him what he deserves." Richard's voice rose higher, shrill with desperation. "You're all complicit. Do you hear me? Complicit. but his words bounced off empty faces. The power he had wielded for years, the fear he had thrived on, was crumbling before him. The protagonist didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, his machines forming an iron wall around the community, his silence louder than Richard's rage. And deep down, every man watching understood the message. Richard wasn't in control anymore. The neighborhood was. And this was only the beginning. Richard stormed down the front steps of his brick home, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as though each step could shatter the earth beneath him. His face was flushed red, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool morning air. The sight before him, bulldozers parked across the main road, engines quiet but hulking and immovable, was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct insult, one that pierced the very heart of the control he had cultivated over this community for years. "Move those machines right now," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some stepping cautiously onto their porches. A few men who had once cheered Richard's authority crossed their arms now, watching, their faces unreadable. The protagonist stood at the center of it all, calm, his arms folded neatly across his chest. His stance was steady, almost defiant, but his expression betrayed no arrogance, only composure. He didn't flinch when Richard closed the distance, pointing a finger inches from his chest. "You've gone too far this time," Richard hissed, his tone trembling between anger and fear. "I'll have you arrested before the hour is over. Do you hear me?" Before the protagonist could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the morning air. A pair of police cruisers rolled slowly into the neighborhood, their flashing lights scattering streaks of red and blue across the pristine white fences and manicured lawns. Neighbors whispered, gathering in clusters. Some recorded on their phones, eager to capture what they sensed was history in the making. Richard straightened, his chest swelling with confidence as the officers stepped out. Finally, he muttered under his breath, brushing his suit jacket, "Now we'll see who really runs this place." But his smugness lasted only seconds. The officers did not approach the protagonist with suspicion. Instead, they paused when he handed them a thick binder and a small hard drive. Calmly, he began to explain. "This contains video footage of the driveway destruction," the protagonist said, his voice steady and clear. "These files show the workers Richard ordered to pour cement without consent. Here are the city ordinances proving he had no authority to alter private property. And this," he added, sliding a set of papers free from a folder, "is evidence of financial mismanagement of HOA funds." The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a stern face, flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. He exchanged a look with his partner, who was already connecting the hard drive to a laptop mounted in the cruiser. Richard's confident smile wavered. "What is this?" Richard barked, his voice cracking slightly. "These lies? Fabrications?" He jabbed a finger toward the protagonist. "This man is a criminal. He's blocking a public roadway." The officer held up a hand, silencing him. "Sir, we'll get to that. But right now, we need to review this evidence." As the footage played on the laptop, the crowd of neighbors drew closer. The grainy yet undeniable video showed workers pouring cement across the protagonist's driveway. Their voices carried in the recording. "Boss says cover the whole thing. No exceptions. That's what he ordered? Seems risky. Doesn't matter. He's paying us. Just pour." Richard's jaw dropped. He tried to step forward, but the officer blocked his path. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some gasping, others shaking their heads. A man who had once attended Richard's HOA meetings religiously muttered under his breath, "So it's true. He really did it." The protagonist was silent. He didn't need to argue. The evidence spoke louder than words ever could. By mid-morning, local news vans rolled into the community, their satellite dishes rising, cameras pointing at the heart of the unfolding drama. Reporters hustled to the edge of the crowd, microphones ready, narrating the spectacle to a wider audience. The once pristine image of a strict but responsible HOA president was unraveling on live television. Richard's desperation grew. He thrust out his arms, shouting over the officers. "Listen to me. He's twisting this. That driveway needed correction. It was an eyesore, a violation of community standards." His words rang hollow, carried more by panic than authority. One of the neighbors finally spoke up, his voice shaking but resolute. "You destroyed his property, Richard, and you've been threatening all of us for years. We stayed quiet because we were afraid. Not anymore." Another man, older and leaning on a cane, added sharply, "You fine me $500 for a lawn ornament." "500. I paid it because you threatened foreclosure. Now we see where all that money went." Gasps filled the air as the protagonist's second folder was opened. Inside were spreadsheets and bank statements, line items of extravagant dinners, luxury purchases, and mysterious transfers. Funds meant for community upkeep had been siphoned away into Richard's personal accounts. Richard's voice broke into a high-pitched protest. Those expenses were legitimate. Business meals, board retreats. But no one believed him now. The officers didn't hesitate. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the metallic sound ringing louder than his shouts. "You can't do this." Richard thrashed, his tie skewed, his face red. "I'm the president. I am the authority here." The officer's reply was calm and final. "Not anymore." Cheers broke out among the crowd. The Bulldozers, still standing as silent sentinels, seemed to loom larger now, symbols of defiance that had sparked the collapse of a tyrant. By afternoon, Richard was in the back of a police cruiser, driven out of the very gates he once guarded with an iron fist. News anchors spoke into their cameras, recounting the charges: fraud, destruction of property, abuse of power, while neighbors, once cowed, spoke freely of years of intimidation. The HOA dissolved under emergency investigation. With Richard gone, no one had the appetite to keep it alive. Neighbors voted unanimously to strip him permanently of authority, ensuring he could never return to power. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Volunteers came together to restore the protagonist's driveway. Men who had never spoken more than a polite greeting to him now showed up with shovels, wheelbarrows, and bags of cement. One by one, they worked alongside his own crew, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. "Never thought I'd be pouring cement for free," one man said with a grin, wiping sweat from his brow. "But after what you did, it feels right." The protagonist smiled faintly, watching the cracks of division in the community slowly being filled, literally and figuratively. He didn't gloat, didn't deliver speeches. He simply helped where needed, his quiet strength speaking volumes. Weeks later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and gold, he stood at the edge of his restored driveway. The air was calm, the neighborhood unusually quiet, almost reverent. Children played freely in yards without fear of sudden fines, and men greeted one another across fences without suspicion. The protagonist folded his arms, breathing deeply. His fight was over. Justice had been served, not with shouting or fists, but with patience, evidence, and resolve. Richard, once the self-proclaimed emperor of the community, was now nothing more than a memory, bankrupt, disgraced, forgotten. The protagonist smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the last light of day touched his home. Peace had returned. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of neighborly conflict, the abuse of authority, and a strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.